Well, hello, ladies, gentlemen, people, all different variety of thinking creatures. And happy Easter Monday to those of you out there who are watching this now. Well, I suppose happy Easter Monday to everybody who cares. I'm glad to be here. I want to, first off, before I start any reading or anything like that, want to thank my friend Ilva, whose suggestion it was that I do this late night version of the stories I've been reading lately. And with the idea in mind that since I know very well that I have lots of friends outside of the United States, and especially, in quite different time zones, that it might be a good idea to do something at a different time. So here I am. I'm going to read a story tonight, and that's all I'm going to do tonight because, in fact, it's a fairly long story. So I picked it because, unlike most of what I've been reading, which is kind of more funny stuff, or at least I think it's funny. I hope other people find it funny. This one is a little bit more serious. I don't know if it's serious so much as it deals with issues of kindness and forgiveness and things like that, which seem to me to be an appropriate subject for an Easter Monday in the middle of coronavirus, COVID-19 lockdown, and everybody getting more and more familiar with their own furniture and family and four-legged friends than they probably ever wanted to, which is definitely what's going on at our house. We are ourselves are socially distancing with a fairly large crew. We have 4 college-age young people in the house with us, and we have 3 dogs, a cat, and a snake. And so we're all kind of hunkered down together here in California. The snake, by the way, her name is Steve Irwin, the crocodile hunter, but we just call her Irwin for short. And what else was I going to say? Can't really remember because it's 1 o'clock in the morning my time. My brain has already turned to halva or something similar that is not really useful for thinking, whatever other uses it might have. So I'm just hanging out. But I do want to say hello. Lovely to see those of you who are here. I can see already some people posting comments, which is very pleasing, and I'll try to look at them later on. It's very difficult. There, Ulf has said, good morning from Germany. Well, guten Morgen, mein Freund Ulf. And everybody else, lovely to see you. Hi, Cindy, I see you too, and various other folks. And unfortunately, I can't read books, which I have to hold up close because I am very old now, and also read the comments on the side. So I'll have to read the comments later. So, because otherwise I have to lean in like this, and it's very spooky trying to do that. So anyway, as I said, it's a longish story, so I want to jump right into it tonight. This is a story called The Stranger's Hands, and this version I'm reading is from a very nice anthology done by the folks at Tachyon Press called The Very Best of Tad Williams. The Very Best. The story was originally written for an anthology called Wizards, I believe, which I think was edited by Gardner Dozois and George R.R. Martin, but I'm not 100% certain about that, and I can't find my copyright at the moment. So I'm reading it out of this other anthology. But it is the very best. That's what it says right here. Whoops. On the cover, the very best. So you know that this is pure quality. Other than that, just hanging out. It's been a long Sunday. I already did a reading once tonight. So here I am in my office late at night, sitting here in my Beatles t-shirt. And the last reading I did last week, I was dressed up formally, wearing an ascot and everything. Nothing so exciting tonight, just me in my Beatles t-shirt. So anyway, without further ado, one last thing. which is that I do not intend to make this the only time I read at a time when people can access it live in Europe and other places, and I'll have to do a kind of a little study of what will work best time wise. But I intend to do this more as long as we're all locked in together. There's nothing I like better than a captive audience. It just makes me so happy. I'm like a Bond villain with Mr. Bond strapped into my insane torture device. And I can do whatever I want. And of course, it'll all come to failure in the end. But it's enjoying the moment that's important, and that's kind of the theme of my life. It'll all come to nothing in the end, but I'm enjoying the moment. Anyway, this is a story, as I said, originally written for an anthology called Wizards, and it's called The Stranger's Hands. People in the village had been whispering for days about the two vagabonds in Squire's Wood, but the boy Tobias was the first to speak to them. Tobias was a somewhat wayward lad, and the fact that he should have been grazing his father's sheep on the hill above the forest at that hour more or less assured the sheep in question would be wandering along the shady edges of the wood instead, with Tobias wandering right behind them. It was not until he saw a drift of smoke twining like a gray scarf through the trees that the boy remembered that strangers had been seen in the wood. He felt a moment of fear. Why would anyone live out of doors in the cold nights and flurries of autumn rain if they were God-fearing folk? Only robbers and dangerous madmen dwelt under the unsheltered sky. Everyone knew that. If he had been a fraction less headstrong, Tobias would have turned around then and hurried back to the hillside, perhaps even remembering to take his father's sheep with him. But there was a part of him, a strong part, that hated not knowing things worse than anything. It was the part that had once caused him to pull the leg off a frog just to find out what it would do. It did very little and died soon after, with what Tobias felt guiltily certain was an accusatory look in its bulging eyes. It was also the reason he had dented his father's best scythe when he had used it to try to cut down a tree, and why he had dumped the contents of his mother's precious sewing basket all over the ground. A search for knowledge that ended with Tobias spending all afternoon in the fading light, on his hands and knees, locating every last needle and pin he had spilled. Once this rebel voice had even led him several miles out of the village, on a quest for the town of Eater's Church, which he had heard was so big that the streets actually had names. His father and two other men had caught up to him an hour after sunset as he sat exhausted and hungry by the side of the road. He had got a whipping for it, of course, but for young Tobias, whippings were part of the cost of doing business. So now, instead of turning and leaving the woods and its perilous inhabitants behind, for the sake of his father's livestock, if nothing else, he followed the trail of smoke back to its source, a small cook fire in a clearing. A small man with a rat-like face was tending the flames, his wrinkles made so deep and dark by grime he looked like an apple doll. His large companion, who sat on a stone beside the fire and did not look up even when Tobias stepped on a twig and made the little man jump, was so odd to look at that the boy could not help shivering. The large man's head was shaved, albeit poorly in some places, and the skull beneath the skin bulged in places that it should not. His bony jaw hung slack, the tongue visible in the space between top and bottom teeth, and although he did not seem blind, the eyes in the deep sockets were dull as dirty stones. If the big man was paying no attention, the little man was. He stared at Tobias like a dog trying to decide whether to bark or run. "Your wood's too wet," the boy told him. "What?" "You'll get mostly smoke and little fire from that. Do you want smoke?" The small man frowned, but in dismay, not anger. I want to cook this fish." He had the sound of a southerner, the words stretched and misshapen. Tobias wondered why they couldn't learn to speak properly. He squinted at the man's supper with the eye of an experienced angler. "It's small." "It's better than starving," the man pointed out. "Well, then I'll show you." Tobias quickly found enough dry wood to rebuild the fire, and within a short time the little man was cooking the fish over it on a long stick. His large companion still had not moved or spoken, had not even seemed to notice the newcomer in their camp. "Thanks for your kindness," the small man said. "I am Felix. We are new to this." "My name's Tobias," the boy said, basking in the glow of his own helpfulness. "What does that mean, new?" We have been living somewhere there was food," Felix shrugged. The food ran out." Tobias stared at the other man, who still gazed at nothing, only the slow movement of his chest behind his dark, travel-worn robe showing that he was something other than a statue. "What's his name?" Felix hesitated for a moment. "Eli." He said it in the southern way, the last syllable rising like a shorebird's cry. "He was my master, but something happened to him. He lost his wits." Tobias now examined the big man with unhidden interest. If he had no wits, it couldn't be rude to stare, could it? "What happened?" "The roof fell on him." Felix took the fish from the stick, burning his fingers so that he almost dropped it. Tobias was amused by how many things the man didn't know how to do, and then cut it into 2 pieces with a knife, handing the larger piece to the silent giant. Eli moved for the first time. He took the fish without looking at it, put it in his mouth, and chewed with bovine patience. Felix began to eat the other piece, then turned shamefacedly to Tobias. I should offer some to you for your kindness." Tobias was old enough to understand that this would not be a small sacrifice for Felix. "No, I'll eat at home, and I'd better go now or Father will have the strap out." He looked through the trees to the angle of the sun, which was definitely lower than he would have liked. "He'll have the strap out, anyway." The boy stood. "I'll come back tomorrow, though. I can help you catch better fish than that one." He hesitated. "Have you been to other places? Other villages? Even towns?" Felix nodded slowly. "Many places. Many cities all over the Middle Lands." "Cities?" Tobias swayed a little, faint-headed at the thought. "Real cities? I'll be back." The tall man named Eli suddenly put out his hand, a gesture so startling after his hour of near immobility that Tobias recoiled as though from a snake. I think he wants to thank you," Felix said. "Go ahead, boy. Take his hand. He was a great man once." Tobias slowly extended his own small hand, wondering if this might be the beginning of some cruel or even murderous trick, if he had been too trusting after all. Eli's hand was big, knob-knuckled, and smudged with dirt, and it closed on the boy's slim fingers like a church door swinging shut. Then Tobias vanished. When 2 days had passed with no sign of the boy, suspicion, of course, fell on the 2 strangers living in Squire's Wood. When the man named Felix admitted that they had seen the child and spoken to him, the shire ward and several local fellows dragged them out of the forest and chained them in wooden stocks beside the well in the center of the village, where everyone could see them and marvel at their infamy. Felix tearfully continued to insist that they had done nothing to harm the boy, that they did not even know where he had gone. Both things true, as it turned out. But even if the 2 men had not been strangers, and thus naturally suspect, the villagers could see that the big one was plainly touched, perhaps even demon-possessed, and almost no one felt anything for them but horror and disgust. The lone exception was Father Banity, the village priest, who felt that it was a troubling thing to imprison people simply because they were strangers, although he dared not say so aloud. He himself had been a stranger to the village when he had first arrived 20 years earlier. In fact, older villagers still referred to him as the new priest. And so he had a certain empathy for those who might find themselves judged harshly simply because their grandfathers and great-grandfathers were not buried in the local churchyard. Also, since in his middle life he had experienced a crisis of faith, leading him to doubt many of the most famous and popular tenets of his own religion, he was doubly unwilling to assume the guilt of someone else simply because they were not part of the familiar herd. So Father Banity took it on himself to make sure the two prisoners had enough food and water to survive. It would be a long time before the king's prosecutor general would arrive. His circuit covered at least a dozen villages and lasted a full cycle of the moon. And even if the two were guilty of killing the poor child and hiding his body, Father Banity did not want them to die before this could be discovered for certain. As the small man, Felix, grew to trust him, he at last told Banity what he swore was the true story of what had happened that day. That the boy had touched Big Eli's hand and then disappeared like a soap bubble popping. Father Banity was not quite certain what to think, whether this was a true mystery or only the precursor to a confession, a man easing gradually into a guilty admission as into a scalding bath. But he stuck by his resolution to treat them as innocent until they told him otherwise or events proved the worst to have happened. One day, as he was holding a ladle of water to Eli's dry lips, the big man suddenly looked at him almost as if seeing him for the first time, a flash of life in the dull, bestial eyes that Banity had not seen before. Startled, the priest dropped the ladle. The big man lifted his hand as far as he could, with his wrist restrained by the stalks, and spread his long fingers like some strange flower blooming. "Don't," whispered Felix. "That's what the boy did." Father Banity hesitated for only a moment. Something in the big man's strange gaze, something solemn and distant but not unkind, convinced him. He reached out and allowed Eli's hand to fold around his. For a startling moment, Banity thought he had become a fish, jerked, thrashing out of the river and up into daylight, blinded by the sun and its prismatic colors, dazzled by the burning air. Then, a half instant later, he realized it was as though he had been out of the water for years and now had suddenly been plunged back into it. Everything that had withered in him suddenly sprang back to life. All the small losses of the passing days and months, color, feeling, ecstasy. The feeling was so strong, so overwhelming, that he could not even answer Felix's worried questions as he staggered away. Banity knew again. He had forgotten what it felt like, but now he remembered, and the thunderous force of belief returning betrayed how much he had lost. God had sent him a miracle in the person of the silent giant, and with that single touch, a world which had slowly turned gray around him over the years had been kindled back into flaming life. God was in everything again, just as he had been when Banity had been a child, when he had been able to imagine nothing better than to serve him. God was alive inside him. He had experienced a miracle. It was only when the first surge of ecstatic happiness had become a little more ordinary, if no less pleasurable, that Father Banity realized nothing tangible had actually changed. It wasn't so much that God had shown him a miracle, a sign. It was more as if touching the giant's hand had reawakened him to the love of God he had once had, but which had slipped away from him. It was Eli, he realized, although undoubtedly acting as God's messenger, who had given him back his love of the Lord, his belief in a living creation, and most of all, his certainty that what was meant to be. The silent, damaged man had given Banity his heart's desire, even though the priest himself had not known what it was. Grateful, renewed, the priest resolved to speak on behalf of the two prisoners when the prosecutor general returned to the village to tell the truth, even if it meant admitting that he had for a time lost his own faith. Father Banity would undoubtedly have been their only defender, except that, on the day before the traveling law speaker rode into town, the boy named Tobias came back. He had been, the boy told the villagers, and very gleefully too, in the town of Eater's Church, and it was just as big and wonderful as he had imagined. "They have lots of dogs," he said, his eyes still bright with the spectacle he had seen, "and houses that go up and up, and people." He seemed to feel that the whipping his father had just given him, on general principles, since the actual mechanics of the boy's disappearance were still a mystery, was a small price to pay for all he'd seen. Tobias knew nothing about how he had got from the village to the far-off town. It had happened in an instant, he said, from clasping Elie's hand to finding himself in the middle of the Eater's Church marketplace. But unfortunately, there had been no equally magical way of returning. It had taken him all the days since he had been gone to walk home. When the prosecutor general arrived the next day, there was no longer a case for murder to be tried, although several of the villagers were talking darkly of witchcraft. The prosecutor general, a small, round, self-important fellow, with a beard on his chin as small and sharp as an arrowhead, insisted on being taken to see the two former prisoners who had been released to their campsite in Squire's Wood, if not to their previous state of anonymity. Holding out his rod of office, the law speaker approached Elie and said, "In the name of the state and its gracious sovereign, His Majesty the King, you must tell me how you sent the boy to Eater's Church." The big man only looked at him, unbothered. Then he extended his hand. The prosecutor general, after a moment's hesitation, extended his own small, plump hand and allowed it to be grasped. When Father Banity and the other men watching had finished blinking their eyes, they saw that instead of his prosecutor's tunic, the prosecutor general was now unquestionably wearing a judge's robes, cowl, and wreath, and that a judge's huge round golden emblem of office now hung on a chain around his neck. Some also suggested that he had a stronger chin as well, and more penetrating eyes than he had heretofore possessed. The ex-prosecutor general, now a full-fledged adjudicator, blinked, ran his fingers over the leafy wreath on his head, then fell down on his knees and uttered a happy prayer. 12 years I've waited," he said over and over. "Thank you, Lord. Passed over and passed over, but no more." He then rose and with fitting jurisprudential gravity proclaimed, "These men have not practiced any unlicensed witchcraft. I rule that they are true messengers of God and should be treated with respect." Finding that his pockets were now richer by several gold coins, the difference between his old salary and his new, the newly minted adjudicator promptly sold his cart and donkey to Pender, the village blacksmith, and left town in a covered carriage, with a newly hired driver and 2 new horses. Later rumors said that he arrived home to find he had been awarded the King's 14th Judicial Circuit. In the wake of the prosecutor general's astonishing transformation, Squire's Wood began to fill with people from the village, and even some of the surrounding villages, for news travels fast in these rural areas, turning the two men's camp into the site of a pilgrimage. The size of the gathering grew so quickly that Father Banity and some of the wood's nearer and soberer neighbors worried that the entire forest soon would be trampled flat. But the Squire Ward could not turn the newcomers away any more than he could have held back the tide at Land's End. Although none of this swarm of postulants was turned away, not all received their heart's desire either. Elie's hand opened only to one in perhaps 3 or 4, and it was impossible to force the issue. One man, a jar maker named Keeley, tried to pry the big man's fingers apart and shove his own hand in, and although he succeeded, nothing magical happened to him, except that he developed a painful boil in the middle of his forehead the following day. Some of the pilgrim's wishes turned out to be surprisingly small and domestic. A man whose sick cow suddenly recovered, a woman whose youngest son abruptly discovered he could hear as well as he had before the fever. Others were more predictable. like the man who, after clasping Elie's hand, discovered a pot of old coins buried under an ancient wall he was rebuilding. To the astonishment of many, two blighted young folk who lived on neighboring farms, a young man with a shattered leg and a girl with a huge strawberry blotch on her face. Both went to Elie, and both were gifted with a handclasp, but came out again looking just the same as they had before. But within the next few days, the young man's drunkard father died of a fit, leaving him the farm, and the girl's cruel, miserly uncle, who treated her like a servant, fell under the wheels of a cart and died also, leaving her free to marry if anyone would have her. The two young people did indeed marry each other and seemed quite happy, although they both still bore the disfigurements that had made them so pitiable to the rest of the village. The only apparent failure of Elie's magical touch was Pender, the blacksmith, who went to the campsite a massive, strapping man with a beard that reached halfway down his chest, and went away again with the shape and voice and apparently all the working parts of a slender young woman. He left town the same night, trading the prosecutor general's old cart for a pair of pretty dresses, before setting off on the donkey toward the nearest city to start his life over, or at least so he told his neighbors. So no one was ever able to find out exactly how such a strange thing had happened, when others had been served so well. Soon the lame youth and other grateful folk came and built a great tent in Squire's Wood for Elie and Felix to shelter in, and began bringing them daily offerings of food and drink. People were coming to see the two strangers from all around, and even the villagers who had not obtained a supernatural gift came from the silent giant had not received a supernatural gift from the silent giant, came to realize how valuable his presence was. The village was full of pilgrims, including some quite well-to-do folk, who were willing to pay exorbitant prices to be fed and housed near the miracle worker. Father Banity, still basking in the joyful light of his newly recovered faith, did not doubt that Elie and Felix were gifts from God, but he had not lost all caution or good sense either, and he was worried by what was happening to his quiet village. He sent a messenger describing recent events to Dondolin, the nearest accredited wizard, who had an eyrie near the top of Reaching Peak. The wizard had not passed through the village for years, but he and the priest had met several times, and Banity liked the mage and trusted his good sense, certainly beyond that of the village elders, who were growing as greedy of pilgrimage gold as children tumbled into a treacle vat, happily eating themselves to death. Dondolin, the clear-eyed, as he had been named back in his academy days, took one look at the priest's letter, then leaped out of his chair and began packing, a task which takes a wizard a much shorter time than the average traveler. The messenger asked if there would be any reply, and Dondolin told him, "I will be there before you." Then, suiting deed to word, he promptly vanished. He appeared again in the village at the base of the mountain, and took his horse from the livery stable there. Even an accomplished wizard will not travel by magic for 20 leagues, not knowing what he will find at the other end, for it is a fierce drain on the resources. And then he set out. Other than an ill-considered attempt by some local bandits to waylay him just outside Drunken Prince's Pass, an interaction which increased the frog population of the highlands, but did not noticeably slow Dondolin's progress, it was a swift journey, and he reached the nameless village within 2 days. Spurning more ordinary couriers, he had sent a raven ahead, and as a result, Father Banity waited at the crossroads outside of town to meet him. When they had greeted each other, fondly, for the respect was mutual, despite their differences on the theological practicalities, Banity led Dondolin through the fields around the outskirts of the village, so as not to cause more ruckus and rumor than was necessary. Already the village practically breathed the stuff, and the pilgrims arriving daily from all over only made things more frantic. "Do you wish to speak to the two of them?" Banity asked. "It will be difficult, but I might persuade the village elders to let us close off the camp, although it will not be easy to remove all the addled folk who are living there now. They have practically made a new town in the middle of the forest." We should decide nothing until I see these miracle men, Gondolin said. Although I must say that the description of them in your letter gave me an unpleasant feeling in the pit of my stomach. Why? Asked Vanity with some alarm. Do you think they mean harm? I worried mainly that so many pilgrims would jeopardize the safety of our little town, drawing thieves and confidence tricksters and such. But surely God has sent those two to us. They have done so much good. Perhaps. That is why I will restrain my conjectures until I have seen them. They made their way through the woods, between groups of revelers singing and praying gathered around so many campfires that seemed more like the eve of a great battle than twilight in the woods outside a quiet village too unassuming even to have its own name. As they grew close to the great pale tent and the crowd of people waiting there, some patiently, others loudly demanding that they be allowed to see the wonder workers because their need was so great, Vanity found it increasingly difficult to make headway through the throng. It was a mark of how many of these people were strangers to the area that the village's well-respected priest almost got into 2 fights, and only Dondolin's discreet use of a quelling charm got them past those at the front of the line without real violence. They slipped through the tent's flap door. Dondolin looked across the big tent at the miraculous pair sitting like minor potentates on high-backed chairs the villagers had built them. The small man, Felix, and the big man with the misshapen skull. Felix was scratching himself and laughing at something. Elie was staring down at one of the kneeling postulants before him, his expression as emptily self-absorbed as a bullfrog waiting for a fly of sufficient size to happen past. Dondolin swallowed, then stepped back out of the tent again, and Vanity followed him. Even by torchlight, the priest could see the wizard had gone quite pale. It is indeed as I feared, Vanity. That is no poor traveler, innocently touched by God. Or at least that is not how he began. The large man is the dark wizard, Eleazar the Devourer, scourge of the southern lands and greatest enemy of the archmage Kettle of Thundering Crag. Eleazar? Vanity suddenly found swallowing difficult. Even a village priest knew the Devourer, who had burned whole towns because he liked the gloomy skies their smoking ruins provided, who had performed vile rites to turn men into beasts and beasts into men, and whose campaign of violent conquest had only been stopped by Kettle himself, the greatest wizard of the age who had come down from his great ice caverns atop Thundering Crag and helped the young king defeat Eleazar's vast army of slavering beastmen at the field of Herodsburn. Kettle himself had dueled Eleazar before the gathered forces of both armies. The skies above Herodsburn, everyone remembered, had lit up as if with 6 simultaneous thunderstorms, and although neither had managed definitively to best the other, it had been Eleazar who had fled the field, his plans in ruins, and who had retreated into a dark obscurity that had covered him for years, an absence that had lasted until this very moment. That, Eleazar? Murmured Father Vanity. Here? I would stake my life on it, said Dondolin, and may be doing so. Even if his mindlessness is real, just seeing someone like me that he has known might shock him back to his prior self. But we cannot simply leave it. We cannot leave things this way. No, no, but I dare not go near him. His miracles, you tell me, are real, so he still wields mighty powers. Even if he stays witless, I cannot afford the chance he might decide to give me my heart's desire. Dondolin shook his head, his white beard wagging. The heart of a wizard, even a relatively decent one like myself, is full of dark crevices. It is the world we inhabit, the wisdoms we study, the powers we have learned to harness, if not always to understand. He smiled, but there was not much pleasure in it. I truthfully do not know my heart's desire and have no urge whatsoever to discover it this way. I'm not certain what you mean. What, my dear Vanity, what if my heart's desire is to be the greatest wizard of my age? I felt that way once when I was young and first entering the academy. What if that desire has not gone, only hidden? He shook his head again. I dare not risk it. But what if an ordinary mortal, someone not a wizard, has the same thing as his heart's desire? Or something worse, asking for the end of the world or something. Gondolin gave the priest a shrewd, sober look. But so far, that has not happened. In fact, the power Eleazar wields seems not to have harmed much of anybody, except by your account, a pair of nasty old folk who deliberately stood in the way of their children's happiness. And even there, we cannot prove that coincidence did not carry them away. Perhaps there is something to Eleazar's magic that is self-limiting, something that prevents him from granting any but mostly benign wishes. I do not know. He looked up. I do know that we must discover more before we can make up our minds. We cannot, as you said, simply leave things be, not with Eleazar the Devourer here, surrounded by eager supplicants, busily creating miracles, however kind-hearted those miracles may seem. Gondolin ran his fingers through his long beard. Not to mention the evil chance that this is all some cruel trick of Eleazar's, that he only shams at having lost his mind and plots to seize the Middle Lands again. He frowned, thinking. When do they stop for the night? Soon, when my sexton rings the church bell for evening prayer. Wait until that bell rings, Father. Then bring me the man, Felix. The small man seemed almost relieved to have been found out. Yes, it is true. He was once Eleazar, the greatest wizard of all. After Kettle, the archmage, you mean, said Gondolin. Felix waved his hand. My master poured his soul into 5,000 beastmen at Herodsburn, animating them throughout the battle. Even so, he dueled Kettle Hawkface to a standstill. This is neither here nor there, said Father Banity impatiently. Why is he the way we see him? Is this some new plot of his, some evil device? Tell the truth, minion, and do not think to trick me, Gondolin said harshly. Even now, Kettle himself must be hearing news of this. He will not take longer than I did to deduce that your Elie is in fact his old arch-enemy. Felix sighed. Then we must be moving on again. Sad, that is. I was enjoying it here. Damn it, man. One of the most dangerous men in the world sleeps 20 paces away. Talk to us. Dangerous to you, perhaps. Felix shook his head. No, not even to you. Not now. There is no trick, wizard. What you see is the truth. The old Eleazar is gone, and dumb Elie is what remains. It was after Herodsburg. You see, when the king and your wizard's council turned us away. With all his beast men dead or changed back to their former selves, my master left the field and retreated to his secret lair in the Dark Slide Mountains. We suspected he had a bolt hole there, murmured Gondolin, but we could never find it. He was determined to have his revenge on Kettle and the others, continued Felix. I have never seen him thus. He was furious, but also weary and distraught. The small man peered at the priest and the wizard for a moment. Once, in middle night, when I was awakened from sleep by a strange noise, I found him weeping. I cannot believe that, said Gondolin. Eleazar, the Devourer? Believe what you will. There was always more to him than you folk on the council understood. Whatever the case, he became fixed on the idea of securing the amulet of desire, which can grant its possessor whatever gift he most wants. He spent many months, a year almost, pursuing its legend down many forgotten roads in old books and older scrolls. He spoke to creatures so fearsome I could not even be under the same roof while they were conversing. The memory still seemed to make Felix fearful and yet proud of his bold master. At last the time came. Deep in our cavern home in the Darkslide Mountains, he prepared the spells. I helped him as best I could, but I am just a servant, not a necromancer. I stoked the fires, polished the alembics, brought the articles he needed from our reliquary. At last the hour came when the spheres were in alignment and he began the summoning of the empty gods. He had been nights on end without sleep, in the grip of a fever that I had never seen him in before, even on the night before Herodsburg, when dominion over all the world was still at his fingertips. Pale, wide-eyed, talking to himself as though I was not even present. He was like a prisoner, desperate for release, whether that release came from the opening of a prison door or from the hangman's rope. Felix sighed and briefly wiped his eyes while Dondalin tapped impatient fingers. The spell went on for hours, the small man continued. Names shouted into the darkness that hurt my ears. At one point I fled, terrified by the shadows that filled the room and danced all around me. When I came back, it was because I heard my master's hoarse cry of triumph. He stood in the center of his mystical diagram, holding up something I could barely see, something that gleamed red and black. Something cannot gleam black, Dondalin said, a trifle querulously, Vanity thought. It makes no sense. Little of what happened that night made sense, but I will not change my tale. It gleamed, red and black. Eleazar held it over his head, crying out with a ragged voice, "My greatest wish made real!" And then the roof collapsed. Collapsed? Said Vanity. How? I thought you were in some mountain cavern. We were, Felix agreed. I still am not certain how it happened. It was like being chewed in a giant's mouth. Chewed, and then spit out. When I woke up, we both lay on the slope beneath the entrance to the lair, which was choked with fallen rock. Eleazar was, as you see him now, crushed and silent, his head all bloody, poor fellow. The amulet was gone. Everything was gone. I helped him up, and we stumbled and crawled down the hill to a Cotsman's deserted shack. The owner had fled when the mountain began to shake. I shaved my master's head and doctored his wounds. We ate what supplies the Cotsman had laid in, but when we ran out, we had no choice but to become wandering beggars. The small, wrinkled man spread his hands. I can do no magic, you see. Was the boy in the village, the one Eleazar sent to Eater's church, the first to be touched? Felix shook his head. My master took a few people's hands, mostly folk who gave generously to our begging bowl, and sometimes things happened. None were harmed, all profited, he added, a little defensively. And you, Dondalin demanded, you must have touched his hands many times since this occurred. What of you? What could happen? I already have my heart's desire. All I have ever wanted was to serve him. From the first moment I saw him outside the academy, I knew that he was my destiny, for good or bad. Gondolin sighed. For bad, certainly, at least until now. You are not a true villain, Felix, but you have served an evil man. All great men are thought evil by some. Not all great men graft the heads of wild boars onto the shoulders of peasant farmers, Gondolin pointed out. Not all great men wear the skins of other wizards for a cloak. He killed only those who turned against him, said Felix stubbornly. Only those who would have killed him. Gondolin stared at him for a moment. It matters little now, he said at last. As I said, Kettle will have heard by now and guessed who is here. The Archmage will come, and things will change. Then we must go, said Felix, rising to his feet with a weary grunt. We will move on. There are still places we can live in quiet peace if I only help my poor master to keep his hands to himself. I dare not try to stop you, Gondolin said. I fear to wake your master if he really sleeps inside that battered skull. I admit I was never his match, but even if you flee, you will not outrun Kettle's power. It does not matter. What will be, Banity thought to himself, but a little of his newfound peace had gone with Elie's unmasking. Whether Eleazar is a man transformed or a villain disguised, surely what happens next will be as God wills too. For who can doubt his hand when he has shown us so many miracles here? But Elie would not leave the woods, despite Felix's urging. The mute man was as resistant as a boulder set deep in mud. None of his servants' pleas or arguments touched him. In fact, he showed no sign of even hearing them. Gondolin and Banity, armed with the knowledge of the miracle worker's true identity, convinced the suddenly terrified village elders that for a while at least the crowds should be kept away. With a contingent of soldiers from the nearest shire post, hired with a fraction of the profits from the long miracle season, they cleared the forest of all the supplicants, forcing them out into the town and surrounding fields, where local sellers of charms and potions gleefully provided them with substitute satisfaction, or at least the promise of it. Even as the last of the camps were emptied, some of the latest arrivals from beyond the village brought news that Kettle Hawkface himself was on the way. Some had seen nothing more than a great storm swirling around Thundering Crag, while the sky elsewhere was blue and bright. But others claimed to have seen the Archmage himself speeding down the mountain on a huge white horse, shining as he came, like a bolt of lightning. In any case, those who had been turned away from Squire's Wood now had something else to anticipate, and the great road that passed by the nameless village was soon lined with those waiting to see the most famous, most celebrated wizard of all. Father Banity could not help wondering whether Eleazar sensed anything of his great rival's coming, and so he walked into Squire's Wood and across the trampled site of the camp, empty now but for a couple of hired soldiers standing guard. Inside the tent, wrinkled little Felix looked up from eating a bowl of stew and waved to Banity as if they were old friends, but Eleazar was as empty-faced as ever, and seemed not to notice that the crowds of pilgrims were gone, that he and Felix were alone. He sat staring at the ground, his big hands opening and closing so slowly that Father Banity could have counted a score of his own suddenly intrusive heartbeats between fist and spread fingers. The man's naked face and shaved scalp made the head atop the black robe seem almost like an egg, out of which anything might hatch. Why did I come here? Banity asked himself. To taunt the blackest magician of the age? But he felt he had to ask. Are you truly gone from in there, Eleazar? The priest's voice trembled, and he prayed to God for strength. He now realized, in a way he had not before, that here sat a man of such power that he had destroyed whole cities, the way an ordinary man might kick down an anthill. But Banity had to ask. Are you truly and completely empty, or is there a spark of you left in that husk? listening. He had a sudden thought. Did you bring this on yourself with your magical amulet? When the time came for your heart's desire to be granted, did God hear a small hidden part of you that was weary of death and torment and dark hatreds, that wanted to perform the Lord's work for your fellow men instead of bringing them blood and fire and terror? Ali did not look up or change expression, and at last Father Banity went out. Felix watched him go with a puzzled expression, then returned to his meal. He came down the main road with crowds cheering behind him as though he were a conquering hero, which, after all, he was. Banity watched the people shouting and calling Kettle's name as the wizard rode toward the village on his huge white horse, the same people who only days before had been crouched in the dirt outside Eli's tent, begging to be let in, and the priest wondered at God's mysterious ways. Kettle Hawkface was younger than Banity would have guessed, or else had spelled himself to appear so. He seemed a man in the middle of life, his golden hair only touched with gray, his bony, handsome face still firm in every line. His eyes were the most impressive thing about him. Even from a distance, they glittered an icy blue, and up close it was difficult to look at him directly. Such was the chilly power of his gaze. Banity and Dondolin met the Archmage at the edge of the wood. Kettle nodded at his fellow wizard, but hardly seemed to see the priest at all, even after Dondolin introduced him. He is in there, Dondolin began, but Kettle raised his hand, and the lesser mage fell silent. I know where he is. He had a voice to match his eyes, frosty and authoritative. And I know what he is. I have battled his evil for half my long life. I do not need to be told where to find him. I smell him as a hound smells his quarry. Strange, then, that you did not find him before, thought Banity, and regretted his own small-minded carping. But he is not the monster you knew, Archmage. Kettle looked at him then, but only a moment, then turned away. Such creatures do not change, he said to Dondolin. Banity tried again. He has done much good, Kettle smirked. Has he revived all those he killed? Rebuilt the cities he burned? Do not speak to me of things you do not understand, priest. He slid down off his massive white horse. I will go, and we will see what devilry awaits. Banity had to admit the Archmage was as impressive as legend had promised. He strode into the forest with no weapon but his staff of gnarled birch, his long hair blowing, his sky-blue robes billowing as though he still stood on the heights of Thundering Crag. Banity looked at Dondolin, whose face bore a carefully composed expression that betrayed nothing of what he was thinking. Then they both followed the Archmage Kettle into Squire's Wood. To Banity's astonishment, Ali himself stood in the doorway of the tent, looking out across the great clearing. Ho! Devourer! Kettle's voice echoed, loud as a hunting horn, but Ali only looked at him incuriously, his large hands dangling from his sleeves like roosting bats. I have found you again, at last. The hairless man blinked, turned, and went back into the tent. Kettle strode after him, crossing the clearing in a few long paces. Banity started to follow, but Dondolin grabbed his arm and held him back. This is beyond me, and beyond you, too. Nothing is beyond God, Banity cried, but Dondolin the clear-eyed looked doubtful. A moment later, little Felix came stumbling out of the tent, flapping his hands as if surrounded by angry bees. They stand face to face, he squawked, then tripped and fell, rolling until he stopped at Banity's feet. The priest helped him up, but did not take his eyes off the tent. They do not speak but stare at each other. The air is so thick. It seems, Gondolin began, but never finished. For at that instant the entire clearing, in fact, all the woods and the sky above, seemed to suck in a great breath. A sudden agonizing pain in Vanity's ears dropped him to his knees. Then everything suddenly seemed to flow sideways. Light, color, heat, air, everything rushing out across the face of the earth in all directions, pushing the priest flat against the ground and rolling him over several times. When the monstrous wind died, Vanity lay for a long, stunned instant, marveling at the infinite skills of God, who could create the entire universe and now, just as clearly, was going to dismantle it again. Then a great belch of flame and a roar of rushing air made him roll over onto his knees and, against all good sense, struggle to sit up so he could see what was happening. The tent was engulfed in flame. The trees all around singed a leafless black. As Father Vanity stared, two figures staggered out of the inferno as though solidifying out of smoke, one like a pillar of cold blue light, with flame dancing in his pale hair and beard, the other a growing, rising shadow of swirling black. "I knew you but pretended, demon," shouted Kettle Hawkface, waving his hands in the air, flashes of light crackling up from his fingertips. "Devourer, devourer, I know your treachery of old." The shadow, which had begun to fold down over the archmage like a burning blanket, instead billowed up and away, hovering in the air just above Kettle's head. A face could be seen in its roiling, cloudy midst, and Vanity could not help marveling, even in his bewildered horror, how it looked both like and unlike the silent Elide. "I will make sure your dying lasts for centuries, Hawkface!" shrieked the dark shape in a voice that seemed to echo all the way to the distant hills. Then it rose up into the air, flapping like an enormous bat made of smoke and sparks, and flew away into the south. "Master!" screamed Felix, and stumbled off through the woods, following the fast diminishing blot of fiery blackness until he, too, disappeared from sight. Kettle Hawkface, his pale robe smeared with ash, his whiskers and hair singed at the edges, strode away in the other direction, walking back toward the village with the purposeful stride of someone who has completed a dangerous and thankless job and does not bother to wait for the approbation he surely deserves. As he emerged at the forest's edge, he stood before the hundreds of onlookers gathered there and raised his hands. "Eleazar the Devourer's evil has been discovered and ended, and he has flown in defeat back to the benighted south," the Archmage cried. "You people of the Middle Lands may rest safely again, knowing that the Devourer's foul plan has been thwarted." The crowd cheered, but many were confused about what had happened, and the reception of his news was not as wholehearted as Kettle had perhaps expected. He did not wait to speak again to his colleague Gondolin, but climbed onto his white horse and galloped away north toward Thundering Crag, followed by a crowd of children crying out after him for pennies and miracles. Vanity and Gondolin watched in silence as the ramrod straight figure grew smaller and then eventually disappeared. The crowds did not immediately disperse, but many seemed to realize there would be little reason to collect here anymore, and the cries of the food sellers, charm hawkers, and roving apothecaries became muted and mournful. "So all is resolved for good," Father Vanity said half to himself. "Eleazar's evil was discovered and thwarted." "Perhaps," said Gondolin. "But a part of me cannot help wondering whose heart's desire was granted here today." What do you mean? Do you think they clasped hands?" Gondolin sighed. "Do not misunderstand me. It is entirely possible that the world has been spared a great evil here today. Eleazar was always full of plots, many of them astoundingly subtle. But if they did touch hands, I think it is safe to say that only one of them was granted his heart's desire. I don't understand. Eleazar may not have seemed entirely happy as Eli, the dumb miracle worker, Gondolin said, but he did seem peaceful. Now, though, he is the devourer again, and Kettle once more has an enemy worthy of his own great pride and power. Vanity was silent for a long time, watching the sky darken as the sun settled behind Squire's Wood. But surely God would not let Eleazar's evil back into the world simply because his enemy missed it. God must have a better plan for mankind than that. Perhaps, said Gondolin, the clear-eyed, perhaps we will think on it together after we return to the church and you find the brandy you keep hidden for such occasions. Father Vanity nodded and took a few steps, then turned. How did you know about the brandy? The priest thought Dondolin's smile seemed a trifle sour. I am a wizard, remember? We know almost everything. And that's the end of the story. And with that, I will thank you all very much for joining me. It's lovely to have a chance to make some contact with my friends outside the States, and I have a lot of them, and I'm very glad of that, and very fortunate that way. I hope you are all taking good care, regardless of what your personal situation is. I hope it gets better soon. I hope you are sheltering in place, that you and your loved ones and friends are all safe and well. We are doing well here. We are huddling together and making our way through this interesting time. And I hope you are all doing the same. Again, happy Easter to those of you who are Eastering and have been Eastering. And to everybody out there, be well and be safe. And again, thank you for joining me. Good night.